All right. Hi, I'm Phoebe. I'm a senior engineering manager at Etsy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm based in Brooklyn. I'm not actually in the Etsy office today, but perhaps next week because some folks are starting to go in a little bit next week, which is exciting. Um, and so a little bit about my role. As a senior engineering manager, I'm responsible for leading an initiative of two engineering teams. And my teams are working across the core buying experience on the Etsy marketplace, iOS and Android apps. In my role, I focus on leading my teams to achieve high impact business outcomes that help the communities we serve at Etsy. I grow and scale teams and have worked across web and apps. I also focus on career growth for managers and engineers in my teams and contribute to engineering-wide initiatives. And so was your question also to talk a little bit about how we got there as well, right? Yeah. So yeah. I think hopefully this won't be too long of a spiel for all of you, but I had a fairly long and winding path. I think the first step in my path was I fell in love with computer science and engineering while I was a student at Barnard. I had never studied computer science before college. And I really kind of struggled when I first started to study it because I was really comparing myself to some of my peers who were kind of coming in with a lot more background than myself. So I had a lot of imposter syndrome. And I was kind of used to doing really well and excelling in my studies, and I think it was kind of an adjustment to me to kind of that I had a gap in my learning and was kind of getting used to things. But I knew that this was the passion that I had, and so I persevered through a lot of ups and downs, and it was definitely well worth it. After college, I merged my love of computer science, technology, and art history. And I worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for a while. I started as an intern there, and then I worked there for a few years. I got to work on educational web features for kids and research how to best leverage technology in the museum experience. And this was way back long ago, like at the cusp of when iPhones were coming out and all of that. We were talking about like exploring how you use the handheld device in like a museum setting and all these things. It was a really fun opportunity, and I learned a lot. Later on, I had the honor of working for the artist Kai Guo Chang, and I did all things technical. I worked on art databases, I fixed computers, I was responsible for website, many things. And while I worked for Kai, I realized that I also had an interest beyond just programming and tech work, and my curiosity grew around understanding the work environments, frameworks, and process for helping people come together to achieve great things. So at that point, I kind of looked at expanding my career focus beyond just the actual engineering and implementation and more towards management. And this is where I kind of started to make a transition from being an individual contributor to being a manager. So for a period of time, I worked at Tumblr as a technical project manager where I led large scale cross-team projects. And I'll also say so there was a period of time at Tumblr where I felt a little stuck in my role there and I wasn't sure kind of what I was doing, what I wanted to do. And I feel like I was really lucky because I had some sponsors there who took me aside and really kind of talked to me about what is it that you want? What are the things that you're interested in? They really listened to me and they actually believed in me and gave me a pretty big opportunity there to lead a data center migration, even though I'd never done that before. And it really branched out my domain expertise, my learning. It just opened up a lot of avenues for me. I learned a lot about infrastructure engineering at scale, all of the challenges there. I got to work with all of the different teams. And that was a really exciting experience for me. And it also taught me the importance of having sponsors and people who are going to help open those doors for you and give you those opportunities. And not long after my career at Tumblr, I started at Etsy, where I've been for 5 years. I've led a number of engineering teams across web and apps, and I really love working at Etsy, where I'm always pushed to learn and grow, and I get to work with truly inspiring engineers, other managers, directors, and I love to work on projects that help creative entrepreneurs grow their business. So that's my long spiel. Hopefully it made sense to all of you, but yeah, a little bit about myself.
That's great. Thank you so much. Monica, would you like to share?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I am Monica Powell. I'm a senior software engineer at Newsella, which is an ed tech company. So we focus on creating content for K through 12 teachers to use in their classrooms. And for every single piece of content that we have, there's also the ability for the content to be tailored to individual students based on their reading level. So everyone is able to access the same key concepts regardless of how they compare to like their peers in terms of like reading comprehension. And so there I focus on working on the team that helps teachers and students discover content that is engaging and relevant. And so part of the work that I do is focusing on maintaining the homepage when a user's logged in. If we have new types of content that we're releasing, like videos or things like that, helping to support those initiatives. And then I've also, even though I work like web development, product engineering, have had the opportunity to work closely with our recommendations team. So if there are opportunities to run experiments and figure out how we can improve the type of content that we're showing for specific users based off of like their interests or maybe their activity or things of that nature. That's also something that I've had the opportunity to work with, which has been fun. And then in terms of like how I ended up at where I am right now, when I was at Barnard, I did take some computer science classes and started to like get an interest in terms of learning more about CS. But I like at first, I would say like maybe until like my sophomore year, I didn't really understand like how computer science was related to web development. Like to me, they seemed like very different things. So it took a while for that connection to like become clear to me as like a lot of what you're learning in computer science is fundamental to writing web applications at scale and things of that nature. And so once I graduated from Barnard, I ended up doing the Columbia School of Journalism. They have a program called the LEAD program. So I ended up doing this program over the summer, which you can either do it for like 1 semester or 2 semesters. But it's all about like learning how to gather data from the world. There's a lot of like open data that the government is providing, just like as something that they have to do in terms of transparency, but it's not super accessible in terms of like how it's presented. It's just like a spreadsheet. So what I learned during that program was how to like turn that spreadsheet using like using programming skills like Python and SQL into like a story, and like how to present visual data driven information. And so that was a really cool program for me because I felt like it was very practical in terms of like there's like something very specific that you're trying to accomplish from this data, and it used programming skills in a very like concrete, like how do I get from point A to point B way. And so I was able to then like continue learning out after I completed that program, just like outside of work, because I ended up working in a marketing role at a startup that I had started interning at when I was a student, and then I ended up staying on full time after I graduated. And I was able to then go from just like more like content marketing to focus really on like our email marketing and making sure that the email is accessible, and had the opportunity to write some like HTML, CSS, and automations. And then I got to a point where I really wanted to do more like traditional web development. And so I found that as someone who didn't have a computer science degree, and I hadn't had a like web development role, that it was helpful I ended up doing an internship at a company called Meetup. And so I had the opportunity to, over the summer, really learn like what does it look like to work on a team and contribute to production code, which is definitely something that is like important when you're looking for your first software engineering job. A lot of times they are looking for people who have had experience like actually working at like a company that's shipping large applications. So I really went in there looking for that experience, and then I was able to then stay on full time and just learn like a lot on the job, and then eventually ended up where I am now. But a lot of that, I would say, like really I had like the skill, I had learned some information from like school and the program that I did at the journalism school. But then it was like once I then went then once I got into my career, I really needed that like internship experience, I feel like, to be able to like get more interviews and be like a more competitive candidate. So yeah, that's pretty much how I got where I am.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. Jacqueline?
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jacqueline, she, her. I am a data scientist at Google. I've only been in this role for theoretically a year. I took a bunch of maternity leave though, so like it feels like less than that. So what I do as a data scientist is really a lot of causal inference, analysis, dealing with missing data. The main question is, so I work on the Play Store, which is like the App Store for Android. And I work on, so how do we make the App Store better? How do we make it better for developers? How do we make it better for users? How do we detect fraud? Like all these kinds of questions. And it's been really interesting, really fun. It's very different from sort of what I've been doing before. So my background, I was at Barnard. I came into Barnard thinking I was going to be like a French poetry major. And then I took some stats classes and econ classes, and I realized like, oh, this is a way to really understand and explain and advocate for a lot of really interesting things in the world. Like these tools are extremely powerful in the world we live in. So I went on after graduating and did a master's at Columbia in quantitative methods in social sciences, which was just a one-year master's, and it was really interesting. So I learned more R in particular while I was there. And then like the other participants, I did internships, especially I did internships in finance at that point. And I learned a bunch of SQL, which was useful. And I learned a bunch of SAS, which was not useful, but you never know. And then I worked in consulting, and then I switched gears and I went to work at RAND, which is a nonprofit research think tank down in Santa Monica. And that was a really amazing experience. I got to work on these like incredible projects that I thought were so cool, looking at things like diversity in the military, or how to support victim services organizations, so like rape crisis centers, like this kind of stuff. And so the thing that I really learned to love about stats and data science was just like how broad the questions you could ask were, and how useful you can be in so many different ways. And so after RAND, I went and I got a PhD at Carnegie Mellon it's a really cool program. It's a joint statistics and public policy program. You guys probably should not be thinking about PhDs yet, but if you are, I'm happy to talk about that program in grad school. So I got that PhD. Then I did a postdoc at UC Berkeley, looking at finance, like mobile finance in the developing world. So this is like, you have a cell phone, you can get like a $5 loan, and then you have to pay back like $7, so extremely expensive loans. And we're trying to like figure out what the impacts of that were. And then it came time for the job search. Do I want to stay in academia? Do I want to go into industry? And it was a really tough decision. And you know, this may not be the final decision that I make, but I ended up in industry at Google, and I've been really enjoying it. Yeah, so I think probably my spiel was a little bit too short, but I'm happy to answer any questions here or by email if I can need to fill in some gaps.
That was great. Thank you so much for sharing. So what strikes me as you all talk about your separate journeys is how rich and interdisciplinary and kind of somewhat unexpected, some twists and turns and people to help you along the way, and then interests leading you from one place to another. And just to talk a little bit also about my background, I studied architecture and I did a PhD in architecture. And then I ended up doing a postdoc in a computer science department. So thinking about how computation relates to the built environment in architecture. So Jacqueline, I completely hear you. I hear what you're saying. And so part of how I think about this and my own interest in computing and computation is that I see the interdisciplinarity as a complete asset in the way of thinking about how computing, computation, technology is both integral to our lives, but also we have to have a critical eye on how certain instruments affect our daily lives. And so I'm interested in this from a data science perspective, because it seems that all of you kind of have this interest and you work in some capacity in data science. So I'm curious about like what you think about that, but also what are some key skills and competencies that are essential to your field in particular? That can be your opinion, what you feel is important, or what advice you would give to somebody who's interested in the career path that you took. So we can go backwards this time. So we can start with Jacqueline, then Monica, then Phoebe.
Okay, so yeah, I think the interdisciplinary thing is like probably the most amazing thing about data science. There's this like very famous quote from one of the fathers of statistics that the great thing about statistics is that you get to play in everyone's backyard. Everyone needs data scientists. You can go and like go anywhere essentially, and that's really cool. And I, along with sort of my academic work or my industry work, I've always also done volunteering work that I found like extremely interesting, and there's always opportunities to help. So right now I'm working on a project that's looking at like housing costs in San Francisco. And so yeah, you just get to apply your skills all over the place, and you should never, your curiosity is never sort of starved. So I think in terms of core competencies, maybe number one would be curiosity, that, you know, this field is very fast moving, and there's a lot of questions to be answered, and it really helps if you're just like curious about everything, or at least about a few things. I think also in my role, it's really, really important to be able to sort of hear the problems that people have and be able to translate that into a data science framework, because people will come to you without experience in data science and they won't speak sort of the same language. And so the ability to like really translate between fields and get to sort of the core of what someone is actually trying to figure out, and then translate that into something that you can work on, and then translate it back into something that they can understand and use, I think is a really, really important skill. I guess that's where I would sort of put number one for me. Were there other questions that I missed on that?
No, I think you got, yeah, I think that you got the gist of it. Monica?
Yes. So I would also agree like with what has been said already in terms of like, I feel like the interdisciplinary nature of like technology, data science in general is like super exciting, because like there's people from like so many different backgrounds who can contribute to delivering like very impactful software, and it's not like tech, like it can't work in a silo. So I think that is like really cool, and something that made me like interested in getting into technology, like being able to combine some of my other interests in terms of like either digital art or psychology, and then figuring out how could I blend that with tech. And I would say as like for web development, it's definitely, or in general technology, like because of the, especially because of the interdisciplinary nature, it is really important to be able to collaborate well with like other engineers, but also other project stakeholders. So I know like in the teams that I'm on, we'll have like a product manager, designer, there may be some other folks, and like being able to really work well with those people and making sure that everyone is like super aligned in terms of like what is being delivered is really helpful. And then, but also at the same time, like being able to problem solve and work independently is something that is should also be like developed as someone becomes like more senior in their career, being able to mentor others. Something that I found like helpful as I've like progressed in my career is like different organizations that I previously like attended their workshops, like being able to like either like be a teaching assistant, so maybe able to like volunteer for a few hours, or even volunteer to like lead a workshop, has been something that has been like helpful for me to like reinforce my learnings, but then also like help other people and get used to like explaining different concepts to people who may have very different like background knowledge. So I would definitely say like working on like communication skills, whether that's like with other engineers or non-engineers who are also invested in a certain technology, is definitely super important.
I love that, because you don't often think of working on communication skills if you want to go into software engineering or data science. But I think that that's a really, really important point to make. Phoebe?
Yeah, so I definitely would +1 the kind of combining of different disciplines, especially if you have a passion in multiple areas. I think for me, I had a minor in art history and a major in computer science, and a real interest in working to combine those things. And I think that unlocked a lot of doors for me. I was able to apply to fairly competitive internships and stand out in those internships for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, working for the famous artist Kaigo Chang. And I got to work on things that I was also really passionate and excited about that combined my interests too. And I think for the more general question of kind of thinking about different skills or competencies, I think for me as a manager, it's important that I have the kind of grounding in technical domain knowledge and expertise, but also really in the collaboration, communications, and leadership competency areas is also equally important as a manager. I think something else that stands out to me is also just the importance of learning, curiosity, kind of leveraging your curiosity, being open to learning new things, and kind of working iteratively, kind of the way that many of us approach problem solving for something technical, and how you might apply that to also learning other skills or competencies or things in your field. I've found kind of the type of problem solving and thinking skills that I learned at Barnard definitely applied to kind of other things in my life and my career, and kind of how I approached learning and problem solving.
So great. Yeah. I feel that there's always an application for critical thinking, or the way that thinking is introduced in different disciplines can always be used to one's advantage when they're working interdisciplinarily. So just to shift slightly the focus, I'm also curious about the way that COVID-19 in the last 18 months and any move to like a virtual hybrid environment has impacted any one of you. And so Phoebe, you were saying a little bit earlier that you may move to in-person, but I'm just curious about what it's been like, if any of you were in the job market, or even advice for students who may be looking to go on the job market in the current environment. And so I'm going to switch it up a little bit. We'll go with Monica, and then Phoebe, and then Jacqueline.
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, changes, I did end up switching companies during the pandemic. But right before the pandemic, I was working at a company where it was kind of hybrid in terms of like there was a flexibility. I could work from home a few days a week, and there were some people who worked full-time remote. But I think definitely for me, it was very different switching from like sometimes coming into the office to like being like completely remote. And I found that I've had to like work more like independently, just because in terms of like being in a physical office, it's easier to like just accent, like if someone's sitting next to you, be like, oh, hey, like I'm having this issue, like what are your thoughts, or things like that. And like I feel like for me that doesn't translate as well to like I'm not necessarily going to send someone a message when those like little things come up. So it definitely has like given me the opportunity to like spend more time just kind of like sitting with problems a little bit longer and trying to like really figure them out. And so I felt like I've gotten a lot more opportunity to work independently. Working remotely, I did do some like contract work, which was definitely like a huge like growth opportunity for me, because there was just like so much context that I didn't have, and I had like something very like specific that I was supposed to work on. And so I definitely had to do like a lot of investigation in terms of seeing like how the different states of this repo over time. This repo was actually like open source, but it was like forked from another repository. So a lot of like gathering to understand like what were the organizational reasons to decide to like create this separate project. What are the changes that are kind of happening in this upstream project that could potentially impact the work that I'm doing? So I feel like it definitely has like pushed me to kind of just be more independent in general, just like working remotely, but then also having to be better about asynchronous communication. So just like being like making sure that people are aware of like if there's any like blockers or things of that nature. And so yeah, I would say just in general is to spend more like giving like updates throughout the day, just so that people, if I have like if I do want help or something, because it's like a little bit different than like just casually asking somebody. But I would say in a lot of ways it's similar to in terms of like the types of meetings and such that I'm in, or similar to the same types of meetings that I had when I was working primarily in an office.
Thank you. Phoebe, could you also talk about what your opinions of the job market, if you have any, just thinking about general entry into the field at this point in time, as well as your own experience?
Sure. So I think first off, at Etsy, I was working at Etsy when the pandemic started, and we had previously been partly hybrid before as well. So when we went fully remote, I think it was probably less of a lift than maybe some places that didn't already have certain kind of best practices around hybrid teams. But it was still a pretty big adjustment. I also switched teams at that time. And so I landed on a new team in a new domain area. I switched from a web focused team to an apps focused team. And I definitely was a little bit nervous about being able to build the trusted rapport with a team of people that I was not going to be able to meet in person for an undetermined amount of time. So that was an interesting experience for me. I'd say like some of the skills that I had to dial up or saw like my peers kind of like really kind of leaning into. One of them would be around communications and collaboration, in particular active listening skills. For me, it was like really important to focus on, was I listening to the needs and the challenges and the experiences that everyone was having on my teams? And that was really helpful for me to make sure that I was helping people work through all of the challenges or the kind of shift to working differently. And we were able to kind of iterate and learn as a team. And also making sure that I was encouraging other folks to listen to each other as well. I think other things that were also really important was focusing on health and wellness. I think making sure that people on my team knew that that was a priority for everyone on the team and how we could support each other in that. I think with the shift to working fully remote, some people, such as myself, struggled with maybe working more hours or not getting up and walking around during lunch that we were kind of used to doing. And so I think all kind of talking about it openly, how we could all support each other and kind of building better work habits while we all kind of made that switch that was quite different for many of us. I think for the other question about kind of the job market, I guess, are you anything in particular about the job market question to hone into on that? Or
so I guess this is a question on behalf of students who may be listening in, and then there will be an opportunity for Q&A for somebody who has more kind of detailed question about this. But let's say a student is interested in data science and its applications, or in web dev, and they're building the skills to do that right now, and they're just looking at the job market in this environment. What would that look like for somebody who has either entry-level skills or is looking to come in at an entry level where they can learn a little bit more? Do you feel that the market is kind of more open to those kinds of applicants, or they will need to do specific things like more networking and use their Barnard connections? Or what would your advice around that be?
I think it's actually a really great time. I think the market is really competitive right now. And it's in the favor of engineers, whether you're new in your career or you're a few years in, things will be on your side. I think that companies like where I work used to have certain criteria around people who are more junior working remotely from different places, but that is completely changed now. We've seen the success in having fully remote internship programs, fully remote programs with folks who are just starting their careers. So I think a lot more companies, Etsy is probably not the only one, are going to be even more open to having people who are just starting out in their career. So I think this is actually a really great time. I think there'll be a lot of flexibility where I am. Everyone at every stage in their careers will have a lot more flexibility to choose where and how they're working, and make sure that you're picking a place that's comfortable for you. So I think it's a great time. I think that this is a great time of the year to kind of explore what internship opportunities. This is where a lot of companies will post internship opportunities for the next summer. there's also a lot of companies that will have big hiring programs where they're looking to hire a lot of folks who are just starting out, new graduates. So this is a great time to look for those opportunities. Yeah, and I think that it's an exciting time to be in the field.
That's great to hear. Thanks for sharing. Jacqueline?
Yeah, in terms of the job market, I agree with what's been said before. I think if you have some coding under your belt for data science stuff, like more stat side, if you have the stats and the math, at least like a baseline of it. And I think that actually the liberal arts education is really valuable these days. I think you're in a really good position. I think that employers are competing over employees, which is really wonderful. And I'm a little bit jealous because I graduated into the financial crisis, and that's not the case. So I think you guys are in a really good position as far as that goes. I know that it's going to be really weird interviewing. There's a lot of things that sort of aren't happening in terms of like career fairs, on-site interviews. But I know that Google is doing a bunch of training to try to get everyone sort of spun up on best practices for remote interviews and recruiting. So it might take a little more sort of creativity to find the opportunities and do the interviews and stuff, but I think it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I would just say like definitely go out and search for opportunities. And then in terms of COVID for me in remote work, it's been interesting because I came from academia where everyone's kind of on their own anyway, and like very rarely comes into the office. So I was used to going into an office maybe once a week, maybe twice a week for like a meeting with my advisor, and that was it. And so it wasn't a huge change for me. And I kind of like that. But I will say it is harder starting a new job when you don't get to sort of bug people about, what's going on, what are all these systems. Google has like everything is sort of in-house, so you have to learn a whole bunch of new things when you start up. So it is definitely a situation that requires much more intentional communication in terms of like really reaching out and overcoming any sort of embarrassment about asking dumb questions, because you have to sort of write them down. And being very, very explicit with my manager of sort of like, this is exactly what I'm working on. These are my goals for, the next week, the next month, the next quarter. Does everything look good? Here are my updates. So again, that communication part has been really important. But otherwise, yeah, I think that for data science, generally COVID has been an opportunity for people to really question some of the constraints that they put on their workers and find that a lot of them were not that useful. Like maybe having people in a shuttle for an hour a day is not a good use of their time. So I'm looking forward to never going into an office 5 days a week. And I think that that's like a great change. That being said, there's always the issue of sort of the second shift. And I had a child during the pandemic, and it has been like definitely clear that having people at home, the expectations of taking care of a kid and working have sort of increased, and the burden is heavy on women. And so that's another thing that I think, you should just always be really explicit about with your partner and your manager and everyone around, sort of like drawing these boundaries and like resisting some of these societal pushes is something you may have to do, but probably not for a while.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, because now there's a lot of studies out on how the pandemic has actually disproportionately affected women and women of color, and not only because of the reproductive labor that they've had to take on, but also that some of the first jobs to actually be sacrificed during the pandemic were jobs primarily held by women and women of color. So I really appreciate you saying something about that, and that the shift to like a work from home culture can be tricky for caretakers who are trying to juggle working from home, but also like taking care of other people from home. And it's all labor, and then one part of it is not paid. And so I think that it's a really important thing to bring up. So shifting, I guess, a little bit more towards DEI initiatives, there's also been a focus on DEI, especially in the last 18 months after the BLM protest last summer. And so I'm curious about the relationship between DEI initiatives and the fields that you work in, and whether you can speak about any initiatives that have happened in your workplace with your employers, or conversations you've had with your colleagues, and generally how you feel about DEI initiatives in the field that you're working in. And I guess we can start with Jacqueline, Monica, and then Phoebe.
So I know that there are DEI initiatives at Google. I am sort of too new to have been super involved in any of them. I'm not even allowed to interview people yet. That said, there's also been some really disturbing news in terms of DEI stuff out of Google, and many other tech companies. This is something that I don't have really, I think, anything super useful to say about. It's just something that I have been sort of struggling with how to deal with. And I will say that there are some really, really fantastic movements happening in tech, like all the unionization stuff, I think is really exceptional and important, and standing in solidarity, especially with contract workers at these big companies. But my perspective on DEI stuff in my field right now is that there's mostly more work to be done than work that has been done. And I guess in tech, on the tech side, on the sort of stats side, I would say that stats has like a very important and particular role as a discipline to play in DEI, in that we are responsible for measurement and for sort of interpretation of data, and that is a huge responsibility that should be taken very seriously by anyone who's doing any kind of work around diversity or there's just so much irresponsible stats work that's been done. There's a lot of need for better work, and there's a lot of room for it. And I think if people want to dive into that, then that's like really important and wonderful.
Yeah, I think that it's also important just to consider for a moment that sometimes there's this assumption that STEM or more quantitative fields are neutral by their nature because they're based on like hard measurements and numbers, when in fact these disciplines in and of themselves are created by humans, and therefore there are built-in biases. So I think that's a really excellent point, and I appreciate your answer. Monica?
Yeah, so I would say, like, in terms of the product that my company has, we're really focused on making sure that it's accessible to all students. So some of that is in terms of like web accessibility. So there's the web content accessibility guidelines, and we make sure that we're compliant with their AA level. There's like different levels based off of like which specifications you're following. In general, it's helpful as a or you should, as a web developer, be familiar with these guidelines, but different companies have different thresholds for like how compliant they are or need to be. And then also, we publish diverse content, so that there's like content that ranges different like experiences, identities, etc. And then also I had mentioned earlier that we have like for each article or piece of content, students are able to access it at like their reading level. So we have 5 different reading levels. So making sure that certain people aren't able to access the same information as others in their classroom because of the reading level. And then I would say in terms of like as an employee, I found like at my current company and previous companies, where there'll be like employee resource groups or affinity groups. So an opportunity for folks who have shared like identities to come together and like campaign for things potentially that will improve the work environment, or potentially have like events that would be beneficial to people within the affinity group. So at a previous company, I was in a affinity group for women, and we had a finance event where someone who has a background in finance came and spoke with us and like gave us some good guidance in terms of like personal finance. So sometimes there'll be like educational events or culturally relevant events, or if the company has like a diversity training, they may get feedback from employees who are part of these ERGs or affinity groups. So I definitely have found that like that's a way for companies to like put some money behind some of these initiatives. I think I saw recently that LinkedIn is actually going to like pay people who lead their ERGs, so they get like a nominal amount to run these initiatives, because it can be additional work, especially if you are in charge of like operating the group. But yeah, I found that to be like helpful as someone who's been involved in those across different companies.
Thanks so much for sharing. I didn't know about some of those things, so it's really helpful to know. Phoebe?
Yeah, so I think kind of echoing some of the things that Monica and Jacqueline shared, I definitely believe diversity and inclusion is of critical importance in the field that I'm in, which is product engineering and software development. I've definitely seen a lot of progress, but there's still definitely a lot of work to be done, and we have to keep vigilant and focused on that. A lot of large-scale tech companies, such as Etsy, serve a diverse community that spans the globe. So it's really important that at a product level, everyone is thinking about how do we make sure that our products are inclusive to a very diverse set of communities across the whole world. And then it's always important for us as people who are contributing to building those products to always thinking about how we can dig deeper. What are the things that we can be learning and doing to help mitigate our own bias, striving to be humble, acknowledge failures, and learn where we can, and staying open to new ideas. I think that, as we kind of talked about, like we want to be looking to use real data to validate our ideas, and making sure that we're pulling in diverse perspectives from our community to give feedback along the way. And we're also very aware of when we're interpreting data, that we're all coming at it with potentially a bias. And so we're kind of creating spaces to kind of question that and kind of mitigate that as we go. At a team level, I'm definitely responsible for a lot of the hiring and team building. And so I think a lot about how what role I'm playing in trying to make sure that we have a diverse and inclusive team. I've been through a number of different trainings, things for hiring managers to help mitigate bias in our hiring best practices, to how can I strengthen my active listening skills, strengthen my skills for intervening and speaking up if I see something that doesn't seem right. I think other initiatives that I've participated in, one of the things that I did this year was I led a company-wide hackathon. And in leading that, I got some feedback from engineers who had been to previous hackathons where they didn't feel it was an inclusive environment, and people had some kind of baggage and bad experiences in the past. So something that I did with the leadership team for that event was we worked with our diversity and inclusion team to set some inclusion principles at the start of that event, and message those out very clearly to our audience to make sure that we kind of completely redid and did our own event and tried to kind of reinvent that. And I got some really great feedback from engineers that really appreciated what we did with that. And I think that for me, kind of seeing how there's small things that we can do every day in our day-to-day, and there's also some larger initiatives that we need to invest in as well. Something I think that I also realized over my time at different jobs that I've had is that we should always kind of, if we don't see the change that we think is important, finding people who you trust and can collaborate with you on standing up for the improvements that you want to see is really important, and not just sort of waiting around for someone else to take action when you see something that's really important. Other things I think for where I work, I think I'm very lucky to work at a place where, based on data that Etsy shared out earlier this year, women and non-binary folks make up half of the Etsy executive team, board, and nearly half of our overall workforce, and more than 30% of our engineering team, which is about double most industry benchmarks. For Black, Latinx, and Native American people, we comprise about 12.2% of our workforce. And we have a lot of very visible goals to increase diversity and a lot of different programs that go along with that are both external facing and internal facing. So it's definitely inspiring to see all of these things, but still there's a lot more that every company should be doing. And yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was so thorough. And so I really appreciate you sharing the trainings that you've gone through yourself and some of the initiatives that you're helping to spearhead and some of the things that your company's doing. I think that's really kind of hopeful, I guess. And so I guess at this point, we do want to leave room for some questions. So if students have questions, you can either start putting it in the chat. But as we're waiting for students to ask their questions, can you answer one last question? And this is about your own identity or identities as either a woman or person from an underrepresented background in STEM. How has that factored into your career thus far? So let's start with Monica, then Jacqueline, then Phoebe.
Yeah, so I would say in terms of like how it's factored into my career, like especially as I was first getting into tech, I would go to a lot of tech events that were like focused on women. So like women who code or girl develop it. And so I felt like that was like a really like a way for me to learn new things without like, I think it can be kind of like overwhelming, like going to a new environment and trying to learn things. So I feel like I was able to like find these like communities where I felt like safe and like they were trying to support people of my identity. And so as I then became more involved in technology, I was able to then like give back to those communities. I ended up starting a meetup group for women and non-binary React developers because that was something that I was interested in connecting with other people about, and that gave me the opportunity to then actually connect with people who are working on building React at Facebook. So the engineers from that team, they are interested in supporting the community efforts that I was doing. So the people who have like helped me with this organization don't necessarily identify as women, but they are supporting these initiatives. So I feel like it's definitely opened like a lot of opportunities for me to connect with people who are interested in supporting women in tech or who are women in tech. So it definitely has been like super, super helpful to just give me more perspective outside of the exposure that I would necessarily get like in my day-to-day job. Like being able to see like how people are using React like across the industry and like where different people are in their journeys. And then I also was a member of this organization called Dev Color, which is focusing on Black software engineers. So they're like these kind of like mastermind groups where people who are a part of Dev Color can then like connect with other software engineers on a monthly basis and really dive into their like any like questions they have about like their job, like is this normal, or like how can I get that next promotion and things like that. And so I found that organization like super helpful because I know for me like for a while I was like very like focused on like transitioning into technology. And so then once I got into working full-time as a software engineer, then I had to like reassess like what are my professional goals now that I am a software engineer. And that was one of the organizations that helped me really like hone in on some of my goals.
Thank you for sharing that. Jacqueline?
So yeah, I think that, I mean, one really important thing is like, as Monica said, there are a ton of spaces for women and other identities in tech, and I found them to be just full of really cool, interesting, helpful people. And they're like wonderful, and you should definitely get involved with them as soon as you can. I will say, you know, probably the other way that my identity sort of shaped my experiences is that, sorry, I have like a little bit of chaos happening in my house right now. Like the nanny has arrived and also the mailman. So I didn't start my college career interested in tech or with like honestly no solid background in quantitative stuff. And so I always felt, and I always have felt like a little bit behind. And I think, you know, part of that is imposter syndrome. I'm not behind, you know, PhD from Carnegie Mellon, but it's always that little thought. And so that has been something that I've had to sort of deal with, is just like, you come to this from a different background than some people, and that's okay, and that's valuable. Sorry, now I've lost my train of thought because of all the madness. But I think that's sort of the main things I meant to say. So
these are the realities of the situation. So it's completely fine. And also congrats on having a child. Phoebe, thank you for sharing that. I think that imposter syndrome is totally real. And so it's great to hear you share that. Phoebe.
Yeah, I would say I would echo that imposter syndrome was definitely something that I struggled with a lot throughout my career. I think that for me, when I studied computer science at Barnard, I think I was one of 4 graduates my year in computer science. I was in classes where I was 1 woman out of 60, or, you know, 1 of 3 out of 80 or something like that in a lot of the classes. So it's really inspiring to me to see so much more interest and many more people joining the field. And I think that's great. And I'm really want to be there to help everyone along the way. So if I can do anything, let me know. I think some of the things I struggled with, I remember, you know, walking into a large tech company. It might have been Google, perhaps changed since then, but I walked into Google back in like 2005 with my best friend who's a man. And I remember people shaking hands and they forgot to shake my hand. Everyone shook everyone else's hands, but not mine. And again, you never know in that situation, like, why did that happen? Like, you don't really know. But there's a few other instances like that I remember experiencing. And I think a lot of those small things can add up and kind of feed into any kind of imposter syndrome or things you might already be feeling. I think for me, having those experiences really helped me to understand the importance that the role that I want to play in helping to create inclusive teams and making sure that everyone feels comfortable, that I'm really there as a listener to hear if people aren't feeling that, and how I can make sure that I'm building trust, that people can share that with me if that's what they're feeling, and then me taking ownership over what is my role in helping to improve that. So I think that's one thing that's kind of shaped my experience and you know, me and my role. Yeah.
Thank you. So we do have a minute or so left, and we would love to hear questions from anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question and take the opportunity to ask these amazing panelists a question. Any takers?
Hi, I have a question for Jacqueline, because I was looking into the QMSS program at Columbia, and I think you said you did it right after undergrad. And do you think that was like, you like going straight into grad school, or you would have thought like going into the workforce first would have been a good idea?
I think for me, it was good that I went straight. I sort of treated this master's as like a post-bac. Like I just had some math and computer science holes that would have kept me from, I think, taking a job that really would have been interesting to me. So in that sense, doing it right after allowed me to sort of start in my career at like a higher and more technical level. That being said, I know a bunch of people who went into my PhD program straight from undergrad, and I think that that is a nuts thing to do. I mean, you know, to each his own. Yeah, I think definitely getting a little bit of career and life under your belt before going for a PhD is a good idea. I think for like a 1 or 2 year master's where you just really want to brush up on some technical skills, straight out of undergrad was a smart move for me. Also, there were no jobs. Like it was 2010 and like there was just like no jobs. So.
Any other questions? Okay, well, if there aren't any, then I think we might wrap up. And I just want to thank Phoebe, Monica, and Jacqueline for their time and energy and their willingness to share their experiences with us. And I'm not sure if Beyond Barnard will make contact information available afterwards, but personally, you can email me if you have any questions. And I want to thank Beyond Barnard for putting this panel together. And I really enjoyed the conversation, so thanks.
It's really nice to meet all of you.
It was so nice to meet you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Saima.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.